There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the familiar sound of a key in the lock, or the simple weight of a question hanging in the air. You don't recognize them as hinges upon which your entire future will swing. You only see the disguise. For me, that moment looked like Julian, standing in the doorway of my living room, backlit by the indifferent yellow glow of the hallway light. He looked exhausted, like a photograph left out in the sun. The colors of him faded at the edges. His shoulders, usually so broad and confident, seemed to carry the invisible weight of a long, grueling week. The question, when it came, was not a thunderclap. It was a whisper, almost lost to the hum of the refrigerator. And yet, it was the sound that would eventually dismantle the world I had so carefully, so quietly, built for myself. It began with a simple request, a sentence so mundane I almost missed the fracture line running through it. "Hey," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "Is it cool if I crash on your couch tonight?" I had known Julian for 8 years. We had met in college, two planets thrown into the same orbit by the arbitrary gravity of a freshman dormitory assignment. He was on the 3rd floor, I was on the 2nd, but a mutual friend and a shared disastrous attempt at organic chemistry forged a bond that outlasted the class and the dorm itself. He was everything I was not, effortlessly social, a supernova of easy charm and laughter that drew people in without trying. He moved through the world with a kind of uncomplicated grace, while I observed it from the periphery, my camera a shield and a window. I was the quiet one, the patient cartographer of light and shadow, content to document life rather than hurl myself into its chaotic center. Julian was the chaotic center. Our friendship was the bedrock of my 20s. It was a structure built of late-night conversations over cheap takeout, of movie marathons on rainy Saturdays, of the easy, unspoken understanding that comes from knowing someone's history as well as you know your own. He knew about my failed attempts at dating, my anxieties about my photography career, my tendency to retreat into myself when overwhelmed. I knew about his complicated family dynamics, his frustration with a corporate world that didn't value his creativity, the ghost of his college girlfriend, Amy, who still sometimes flickered at the edges of his conversations. We were a constant in each other's lives, a fixed point in the spinning chaos of postgraduate uncertainty. Our friendship was a room I lived in, comfortable and familiar. I knew the placement of all the furniture. I knew where the floorboards creaked. And I had a secret that I kept locked in the basement of that room. I was in love with him. It wasn't a sudden revelation. It was a slow, creeping dawn I had spent years trying to ignore. It was in the way my stomach would tighten when he'd laugh, a sound like tumbling rocks, deep and genuine. It was in the way I'd find myself cataloging the details of his face. The faint scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood cycling accident, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was truly happy, the exact shade of brown in his hair when the afternoon sun hit it. My photographer's eye, usually a tool of objective observation, became a traitor, lingering too long, committing too much to memory. I loved him with a quiet, hopeless ache that had become a part of my own internal architecture. It was a load-bearing wall in the house of myself. To remove it would bring everything crashing down. So I protected our friendship, the most precious thing I had, by building layers of silence and plausible deniability around my heart. He was my best friend. That was the beginning and the end of the story I allowed myself to tell. So when he stood in my doorway that Tuesday, looking worn thin by the world, and asked to stay, my first instinct was the familiar, practiced one. Of course. It was simple. My couch was his couch. My home was a sanctuary for him, as it had often been for me. I waved a hand dismissively, a gesture meant to convey how little a thing he was asking. Yeah, man, of course. Rough week. I was already moving to the linen closet, my actions a buffer against the sudden, sharp focus of his presence in my space. It was one thing to have him over for dinner or a movie. It was another entirely to have him here to sleep, to cede to the vulnerability of unconsciousness under my roof. The air felt different, charged with a new potential. He sighed, a sound of profound release, and dropped his work bag by the door with a heavy thud. "You have no idea," he mumbled, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Chicago was a nightmare. I think I've spent 40 of the last 72 hours on conference calls. My apartment just feels big and quiet." He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked around my small, cluttered apartment, at the stacks of photography books on the floor, the prints I had tacked to the walls, the general lived-in chaos that was my life. His own place was a sleek, minimalist condo downtown, a place designed for someone who was barely ever there. It was clean and impersonal, more a hotel suite than a home. Mine was a nest. I pulled out the thick quilt my grandmother had made, the one reserved for guests, and a pillow. The fabric was soft and worn under my fingers. "Well, my place is small and noisy," I said, trying for a light tone. "The radiator makes a sound like a dying whale, and my upstairs neighbor is learning the bagpipes, I think. But it's yours for the night." He finally gave me a small, tired smile. It was a ghost of his usual brilliant grin, but it was there. "Sounds perfect," he said. And in that moment, something shifted. It was a subtle tectonic movement, deep beneath the surface of our friendship. He wasn't just crashing here for convenience. He was seeking refuge. He was admitting a need, a vulnerability he rarely showed. He could have gone to his own empty, quiet apartment. He chose mine. The thought was a dangerous spark, and I quickly stamped it out, burying it under the practicalities of getting him settled. That night, I lay in my own bed, in the room next to the living room, and I could hear him breathing. The sound was a low, steady rhythm in the quiet of the apartment, a metronome marking the slow passage of the hours. Every time he shifted on the couch, the old springs would groan, and my own body would tense in response, a strange, sympathetic resonance. I was acutely aware of him, of his physical presence just a thin wall away. It was an intimacy we had never shared before, this quiet cohabitation in the dark. Sleep felt miles away. I felt like a watchman on a tower, guarding something I couldn't name. My carefully constructed walls, the ones that kept my feelings for him contained, suddenly felt porous. His proximity was like water, seeping through the cracks, and I was terrified of the flood. This was the shift, the catalyst. It wasn't a dramatic breakup or a life-altering crisis. It was quieter, more insidious. It was the slow erosion of loneliness, the kind that a high-flying career and a busy social life can't touch. Julian, the sun around which so many people orbited, was lonely. And in his loneliness, he had turned not to one of the many women who were always subtly or not so subtly vying for his attention, nor to his rowdy group of work friends. He had turned to me. He had come to my quiet, cluttered apartment and fallen asleep on my lumpy couch, and the foundation of our friendship, which I had thought was solid granite, suddenly felt like sand. What began that Tuesday night did not remain an isolated incident. It became a ritual. It wasn't spoken of, not directly. There was no formal arrangement. But after his next business trip, a grueling week in Denver, my phone buzzed late on a Friday afternoon. It was a text from him. "Just landed. Mind if I swing by? Don't feel like going back to my place yet." And so he came. He walked in, dropped his bag, and collapsed onto my couch as if it were the only piece of solid ground in a world of turbulence. We ordered pizza, watched some mindless action movie, and by the end of it, his eyes were heavy-lidded, his speech slow with exhaustion. He didn't even ask that time. He just murmured, "Gonna crash here, if that's cool," and was asleep within minutes. I found myself living in a state of suspended anticipation. My weeks became structured around this new, unspoken pattern. I'd keep the fridge stocked with the beer he liked. I'd make sure there were clean towels. My apartment, once solely my own sanctuary, began to feel like a shared space, a harbor. I was the lighthouse keeper, and he was the ship, seeking safe port after being battered by the storms of his life. The metaphor felt both grand and painfully accurate. I was a fixed point of light, watching him come and go, my own heart a silent, complicated engine humming in the dark. The ritual evolved. At first, he was always on the couch. I would leave the quilt and pillow for him and retreat to my bedroom, closing the door behind me. But I wouldn't close it all the way. I'd leave it cracked just enough to hear the sound of his breathing, a strange and addictive lullaby. It was a form of self-torture, this proximity without contact, this awareness of him that thrummed under my skin. I would lie awake for hours, my mind a frantic loom, weaving narratives from the smallest threads of evidence. The way he sighed in his sleep, the way he sometimes murmured a word I couldn't quite catch. I was a detective investigating a crime that hadn't been committed, searching for clues to a mystery that perhaps only existed in my own head. Then, one night, about a month into this new arrangement, he stumbled in later than usual, looking more haggard than I had ever seen him. A big project he was leading had hit a major snag, and he had spent the last 2 days in a state of high-alert crisis management. He barely spoke, just gave me a weary nod and headed for the couch. I was working late at my desk in the corner of the living room, editing a series of photos, the glow of the monitor casting long shadows. I felt him settle onto the couch, heard the familiar sigh. But a few minutes later, there was a groan of discomfort. "Man, this couch," he muttered into the cushions. "It's like sleeping on a pile of rocks," my heart hammered against my ribs. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, my fingers frozen over the keyboard. I was a statue, pretending to be absorbed in my work. "It's not exactly a Tempur-Pedic," I managed, my voice sounding unnaturally casual. There was a long silence, filled only by the click of my mouse and the hum of the computer. Then his voice, quieter this time, hesitant. "Leo." "Yeah." I didn't turn around. I couldn't. "Your bed's big enough for two, right?" The question hung in the air between us, shimmering with unspoken implications. It was a line, a boundary we had never approached before. The living room was neutral territory. My bedroom was mine. It was the sanctum sanctorum of my private life, the place where my guard was completely down. To invite him in felt like granting him access to the most vulnerable part of myself. My mind raced, searching for an excuse, a polite way to say no, to retreat to the safety of our established dynamic. But the words wouldn't come. All I could think of was the exhaustion in his voice, the deep-set weariness in his eyes. I took a slow breath, the air feeling thick and heavy in my lungs. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely a whisper. That was it. That was all the invitation he needed. I heard the couch springs protest as he stood up. I heard his soft footsteps on the hardwood floor. I still didn't turn around, not until I heard the quiet click of my bedroom door closing. Only then did I let out the breath I had been holding, my shoulders slumping. I sat there for another hour, staring at the same photograph on my screen, not seeing it at all. I was trying to rebuild my walls, to fortify my defenses, but it was too late. He was already inside. When I finally went to my room, he was already asleep, a dark shape under the covers on the far side of the bed. He had left more than enough space for me, a wide, empty river between us. I moved with the silent, careful movements of a bomb disposal expert, trying not to disturb a single molecule of air. I slipped under the covers on my side, my back to him, my body rigid. The mattress felt alien, transformed by his presence. It was no longer just my bed. It was a shared landscape, a territory with invisible borders and unspoken treaties. Sleep was an impossibility. I was hyper-aware of everything. The subtle warmth radiating from his body across the empty space. The whisper of his breath, so much closer now. The way the mattress dipped slightly with his weight. My entire being was an antenna, tuned to the frequency of his presence. I felt a desperate, primal urge to turn over, to close the distance, to feel the solid reality of him against me. It was an impulse I had been suppressing for years, and now, with him just inches away, it was a roaring furnace in my chest. But I stayed perfectly still, a prisoner of my own yearning, my muscles aching with the effort of my self-control. This, too, became part of the ritual. The couch was forgotten. Now, when he stayed over, it was an unspoken assumption that he would take his side of my bed. The distance between us remained, a carefully maintained buffer zone. But slowly, imperceptibly, the borders began to blur. Sometimes, I would wake in the middle of the night to find the river between us had narrowed. His arm would be thrown out, his hand resting on the mattress just an inch from mine. Or I would turn in my sleep and find myself facing him, his features softened and unguarded in the dim light filtering through the window. In those stolen moments, I would allow myself to look at him, to really look. I would trace the line of his jaw, the curve of his lips, with my eyes. It was a silent, secret act of devotion. The tension was excruciating. It was a fine, high-tensile wire stretched between us, humming with a frequency only I seemed to hear. Or so I thought. I lived in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety, perpetually analyzing his every word, his every gesture, for a sign that he felt it too. Was the way he leaned into me on the couch when we watched a movie a little too deliberate? Was the hand that brushed my back as he passed me in the kitchen an accident or a message? I was drowning in ambiguity, and the worst part was, I couldn't ask for a life raft. To speak it, to name it, would be to shatter the delicate, fragile ecosystem of our new normal. It was a beautiful, agonizing purgatory. He was getting the comfort he needed, a safe place to land. And I was being slowly, exquisitely torn apart. I started to see our dynamic through the lens of my own work. It was like developing a photograph in a darkroom. The image was there, latent in the paper, but it required the right chemistry, the right amount of time, to emerge. Our relationship was in the developer bath, and I was watching, holding my breath, as the shapes and shadows slowly became clearer. I was terrified of exposing it to the light too soon, of fixing the image before it was fully formed, leaving us with a pale, underdeveloped ghost of what we could be. But I was also terrified of leaving it in the chemical bath for too long, of watching the image darken, overdevelop, and be lost entirely to blackness. The nights were the hardest. In the daylight, we could maintain the fiction of our friendship. We'd make coffee, talk about work, joke about the terrible shows we were binge-watching. It was all so normal, so easy. But when the lights went out, and we were two bodies sharing a space in the dark, the fiction dissolved. The silence was not empty. It was filled with everything we weren't saying. It was a physical presence in the room, a third entity in the bed with us. Sometimes, the weight of it was so heavy I felt like I couldn't breathe. I would lie there, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and I would wonder, is he awake? Is he feeling this too? Or am I just a convenient, warm body, a placeholder for the comfort he can't find elsewhere? The not knowing was a slow poison. The crossing happened on a Thursday in late October. The weather had turned, a sudden, sharp chill chasing the last of the autumn warmth from the air. It had been raining all day, a steady, percussive drumming against the window panes. Julian had been home for the week, a rare lull in his travel schedule, and we had fallen into a comfortable domestic rhythm. It was the most time we had spent together in years, and it was both wonderful and deeply unsettling. He was just there. When I woke up, he was in the kitchen making coffee. When I came home from a shoot, he was on the couch with his laptop, the lamplight pooling around him. He had seamlessly integrated himself into the fabric of my daily life. My apartment no longer felt like mine, it felt like ours. That night, the rain was relentless. It was a night that felt designed for staying in, for burrowing under blankets and shutting out the world. We had eaten dinner sitting on the floor, leaning against the couch, and now we were in bed, the sound of the storm a constant, soothing white noise. The usual river was between us, but it felt smaller tonight, more like a stream. We were both on our sides, facing each other, the distance between our faces no more than a foot. In the dim glow from the streetlight outside, I could see the faint glint of his eyes. Neither of us was pretending to be asleep. The silence stretched, but for the first time, it didn't feel heavy with tension. It felt expectant. It felt like the held breath before a plunge. He was the one who broke it. His voice was so quiet, I almost thought I had imagined it, a stray sound in the rhythm of the rain. Leo, my heart did a slow, painful somersault in my chest. Yeah, I whispered back. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just watched me, his expression unreadable in the shadows. I could feel his gaze on me, a tangible touch. I felt exposed, seen in a way I had never been before. Can I ask you something stupid? He said finally, his voice a low murmur. A small, shaky laugh escaped me. Always, it was our old joke, a line from a stupid movie we both loved, a shorthand for the depth of our history. He took a breath, a small, hitching sound. And then he said the words that recalibrated my entire universe. Would it be okay if I kissed you? Time stopped. The rain stopped. My heart stopped. The entire world seemed to shrink down to the space between our two bodies in that bed. His question was not one of passion or of drunken impulse. It was quiet and tentative and profoundly vulnerable. It was a question that held 8 years of friendship in its hands and asked if it was all right to risk it all. It was the most terrifying and beautiful question I had ever heard. My mind, usually a chaotic storm of overanalysis and fear, went utterly, blessedly silent. There was no debate, no weighing of pros and cons. There was only a singular, crystalline certainty. For years, I had been an observer, a man standing on the shore, watching the tide of my own life. And now, the ocean was asking me to step in. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. Instead, I moved. I closed the final few inches between us, the sheet rustling with the sound of my surrender. My hand came up to cup the side of his face, my thumb brushing against the faint stubble on his jaw. His skin was warm. He was real. This was real. I saw his eyes flutter closed as I leaned in. The kiss was not what I had imagined in my thousands of lonely fantasies. It wasn't a desperate, cinematic collision. It was soft. It was hesitant. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was the taste of coffee and rain and something that was just intrinsically, elementally Julian. It was a gentle pressure, a moment of stillness where all the noise and anxiety of the past few months finally went quiet. It was less a physical act and more a confession, a prayer whispered from one soul to another in the dark. We stayed like that for a long moment, our lips just touching, breathing each other's air. It was the most profound silence I had ever known. When we finally pulled away, we didn't speak. He just moved closer, closing the last of the distance between us, and wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me against his chest. I rested my head in the hollow of his shoulder, his chin coming to rest on the top of my head. His heart was beating a steady, strong rhythm against my ear. For the first time in as long as I could remember, my own heart felt calm. I fell asleep in his arms, feeling like I had finally, after a long and weary journey, come home. The morning after was a brutal awakening. I drifted up from the best sleep of my life, a deep, dreamless peace, to the slow realization of warmth and weight against me. Julian was still there, his arm draped over me, his breathing a slow, even puff of air against my neck. For a few blissful, hazy seconds, I allowed myself to believe that everything had changed. The kiss, the embrace. It was a door opening into a new room, a new world where we could be this, whatever this was. I felt a surge of quiet, radiant hope, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost painful. Then he stirred. His arm tensed, and then withdrew, as if he had touched something hot. He shifted away from me, creating a sudden, shocking gulf of cold air. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing even, feigning sleep. I didn't want to face what was coming. I could feel his stillness, the tense, coiled energy of him. It was a complete reversal of the soft vulnerability of the night before. After a few agonizingly long minutes, I heard him slip out of bed, his movements unnaturally quiet, stealthy. I heard the soft padding of his feet, the quiet click of the bedroom door, then the front door. He was gone. He had left without a word. The silence he left behind was not the peaceful quiet of the night before. It was a hollow, ringing void. The hope that had bloomed in my chest withered and died, leaving a bitter, ashen taste in my mouth. I finally opened my eyes and stared at the empty space beside me in the bed. The sheets were still warm. It was the only evidence that he had been there at all, that any of it had been real. I had been a fool, a complete and utter fool. I had mistaken a moment of lonely, confused weakness for something more. He had been seeking comfort, and in a moment of poor judgment, he had taken it in a way he now regretted. And I, with my years of pathetic, secret yearning, had met him halfway, eagerly, stupidly. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, sick feeling that churned in my stomach. I had ruined it. I had ruined everything. Our friendship, that beautiful, solid thing I had guarded so fiercely, was now a casualty of one stupid, hopeful kiss. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. He didn't text. He didn't call. My apartment, which had so recently felt like a shared home, now felt like a mausoleum. Every corner held a ghost of him. The couch where it started. The spot on the floor where we ate dinner. The bed, which was now just a bed again, large and empty and cold. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, dissecting it, analyzing it with a new, cruel clarity. I saw it now not as a beginning, but as an end. An act of pity, perhaps. A miscalculation. The ambiguity that I had once found so agonizing now seemed like a paradise compared to this stark, ugly certainty. I had been wrong. I tried to work. I went out on shoots, losing myself in the technical precision of aperture and shutter speed. I spent hours in my darkroom, the smell of chemicals a sharp, acrid comfort. But his absence was a constant, dull ache behind my ribs. I'd find myself checking my phone compulsively, my heart leaping at every notification, only to have it plummet when it was never him. He had not just left my apartment. He had vanished from my life. After 4 days of this radio silence, the pain began to curdle into something else. Anger. It was a slow, hot burn. Anger at him for his cowardice, for leaving me in this limbo. And anger at myself, for letting him in, for allowing my hope to override my common sense. I couldn't live like this. The not knowing, the silence, it was a poison that was seeping into every part of my life. I had to know. Even if the truth was the worst thing I could imagine, it had to be better than this ghost-haunted silence. On the 5th day, I made a decision. I put on my jacket, grabbed my keys, and walked out of my apartment with a grim, shaky resolve. I was going to his place. I was going to force a conversation. I was going to demand the dignity of an ending, if that's what this was. The walk to his condo felt like marching to my own execution. With every block, my resolve wavered. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to just let it go, to lick my wounds in private, and try to salvage some semblance of our old friendship from the wreckage. But my feet kept moving forward. When I arrived at his building, I stood on the pavement for a long time, staring up at his window. I didn't know what I was going to say. I just knew that the silence had to end. I took the elevator up, my heart pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm against my ribs. I stood in front of his door, the same kind of door I had seen him stand in front of at my own apartment so many times. But this time, the roles were reversed. I was the one seeking something. I raised my hand and knocked. The sound was too loud in the quiet hallway. I waited. I could hear faint movement inside. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. I was about to turn and leave when the lock clicked and the door opened a few inches. He was there, peeking through the crack. He looked awful. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his hair was a mess. He was wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. When he saw it was me, his eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something, fear, guilt, crossing his face. "Leo," he said, his voice a hoarse croak. "Can I come in?" I asked, my own voice surprisingly steady. He hesitated for a fraction of a second too long before opening the door wider. I stepped inside. His apartment was just as I remembered it, clean, stylish, and completely impersonal. But today, it felt different. There was a tension in the air, a sense of disarray that had nothing to do with the physical space. Mugs were left on the coffee table. His work bag was slumped in a corner, unzipped. It felt like a place where someone was waiting or hiding. He didn't invite me to sit. He just stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I was the one who had come here, so it was up to me to break it. "You left," I said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a statement of fact. A simple, undeniable truth. He looked down at the floor. "Yeah," he mumbled. "I had to. I had an early call. The lie was so flimsy, so insulting, that it broke something open in me. The anger I had been suppressing flared to life. "No, you didn't, Julian," I said, my voice sharper now. "Don't lie to me. Not now. You ran." "What?" He flinched, but he still wouldn't look at me. "I don't know what you're talking about. The hell you don't." The words were out before I could stop them, louder than I intended. "You kissed me. You asked if you could kiss me." and then you disappeared. For 5 days. You don't get to do that. You don't get to open that door and then just slam it in my face and pretend it never happened. I deserve more than that. Our friendship deserves more than that." He finally looked up, and I was shocked by what I saw in his eyes. It wasn't indifference. It wasn't regret. It was pure, unadulterated terror. He looked like a cornered animal. "I can't do this, Leo," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't do what?" I pressed, stepping closer to him. "Can't talk to me? Can't tell me what's going on in your head? What are you so afraid of?" "This," he finally exploded, throwing his hands up in a gesture of desperation. "Us. That kiss. I don't know what that was, okay? I've never. I don't feel that way. About guys." The words were a punch to the gut. "I don't feel that way." It was the confirmation of my worst fears. I had been a mistake. An experiment. My carefully constructed composure crumbled. I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes, and I hated myself for it. "Then why?" I asked, my voice choked with a pain I couldn't hide. "Why did you kiss me, Julian? Was it a joke? Were you just lonely? What was I to you in that moment?" "I don't know," he shouted, and his voice broke. He sank down onto the arm of his sofa, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. "God, Leo, I don't know. All I know is that for the past few months, the only place I've felt, the only place I've felt like I could breathe, is with you, in your apartment. And that night, it was raining, and we were talking, and it just felt right. It felt more right than anything has in a very long time. And it terrified me." He looked up at me, his face a mask of anguish and confusion. "The next morning, I woke up, and you were there, and for a second, it was perfect. And then I panicked. Because what does that mean? What does it mean that I wanted to kiss my best friend, who's a guy? I've been with women my whole life. Amy, this doesn't fit. It doesn't make any sense." So I ran. I ran because I was scared of it. I was scared of what it meant about me. And I was scared of you. Scared of how you would look at me. I stared at him, my own anger and hurt slowly dissolving, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. All this time, I had been living in my own private drama, consumed by my own feelings and fears, and I had never once considered his. I had assumed he was the confident, uncomplicated one, the one who had all the answers. But he was just as lost as I was. Maybe more so. I walked over and sat down on the coffee table in front of him. The anger was gone. All that was left was the vast, complicated landscape of our friendship. "How I would look at you?" I asked quietly. "Julian, how do you think I've been looking at you for the past 8 years?" The question hung between us. He stared at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. And then, slowly, like a sunrise breaking over a dark horizon, understanding dawned in his eyes. The years of my careful glances, my lingering gazes, my unspoken devotion, it all seemed to click into place for him in that one moment. "Oh," he breathed, the word a small puff of air. "Oh, you mean you too?" I gave him a small, sad smile. For a very long time, I admitted. The confession felt less like a monumental revelation and more like a quiet, simple truth that had been waiting patiently to be spoken. I just got very, very good at hiding it. He just stared at me, his mind clearly reeling, processing years of our shared history through this new, startling lens. He didn't speak for a long time. He just looked at me, really looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time. The terror in his eyes was still there, but it was being eclipsed by something else. Wonder. "So, what you felt that night," he said slowly, testing the words. It wasn't just a one-time thing for you, no," I said softly. "It wasn't." He let out a long, shaky breath and leaned back, running a hand over his face. He looked exhausted, but it was a different kind of exhaustion now. It wasn't the weariness of running anymore. It was the weariness of finally stopping. We sat in silence for a while, the hum of the city outside the only sound. The crisis had passed. The confrontation was over. And in its wake, something new and fragile and uncertain was beginning to take root. "I'm sorry, Leo," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry I ran. I was a coward. You were the one person I could always be honest with, and I wasn't. I was a terrible friend. You were scared, I said. I get it. It's a lot. Yeah, he said with a humorless laugh. It's a lot. He looked at me again, his gaze direct and searching. So what do we do now? The million-dollar question. What do you do when the entire foundation of your world has shifted? When the map you've been using is suddenly obsolete? I didn't have an answer. For the first time, I felt like we were on equal footing. We were two people, lost in a new and unfamiliar country, with no idea which way to go. I don't know, I said, and the honesty of it was a relief. But maybe we could start by not running away. Maybe we could just sit with it. Together, he nodded slowly, a small, tentative smile touching his lips. It was the first genuine smile I had seen from him in days, and it was like the sun coming out from behind the clouds. Okay, he said. I think I can do that. I'd like to do that. We didn't kiss again that day. We didn't make any grand declarations or try to define what we were becoming. We just talked. For hours. We unraveled the tangled threads of the past few months, laying them out between us. He told me about the crushing loneliness of his job, the feeling of being a perpetual stranger in a series of identical hotel rooms, the way my apartment had become the only real place in his life. I told him about the years of silent affection, the fear of losing our friendship, the agonizing hope that had tortured me every time he fell asleep in my bed. It was a conversation built of quiet confessions and halting admissions, a careful, gentle excavation of two hearts. When I finally left his apartment late that evening, the air felt different. The city lights seemed brighter. The knot of anxiety that had been lodged in my chest for so long had finally dissolved. Nothing was certain. Our future was a blank page. But for the first time, it didn't feel terrifying. It felt hopeful. We had crossed a threshold, and we had done it together. We hadn't shattered. We had held. The days that followed our conversation were a study in tentative grace. We were learning a new language, a new way of being with each other. The old, easy camaraderie of our friendship was still there, but it was now overlaid with a new, delicate awareness. There was a charge to the air between us, but it was no longer the humming wire of unspoken tension. It was the quiet, crackling energy of potential. He started staying over again, but it was different now. There was no pretext. He would text me, thinking of coming over tonight, and it was a question filled with a new, gentle meaning. And when he arrived, he would find his toothbrush already in the holder next to mine, a silent testament to the shift. He had a drawer in my dresser now, a small space filled with a few t-shirts and a pair of sweatpants, an anchor of his presence in my home. The first night he stayed after our talk, there was a moment of awkward hesitation at the bedroom door. We both stopped, unsure of the new protocol. The ghosts of our old arrangement, of the carefully maintained distance, still lingered. He looked at me, a question in his eyes. I just smiled, took his hand, and led him into the room. His fingers intertwined with mine, his palm warm and solid against my own. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. It was an act of deliberate choice, of intention. That night, in bed, there was no river between us. He pulled me close, just as he had after the kiss, and I went willingly, melting into his warmth. We didn't talk. We just held each other, listening to the rhythm of each other's breathing. It was a different kind of intimacy, deeper and more peaceful than the frantic yearning of the weeks before. This wasn't about seeking temporary comfort from a storm. This was about being the harbor for each other. There was no fear, no anxiety, only a profound and quiet sense of rightness. I fell asleep feeling not just like I was home, but that I was home. We took things slowly, at a pace dictated by his own journey of self-discovery. He was navigating a seismic shift in his own identity, and I knew the most important thing I could give him was patience and space. There were days when I could see the confusion and fear still warring in his eyes, when he would grow quiet and distant. In those moments, I learned not to push. I would just be there, a steady, constant presence, and wait for him to find his way back to me. And he always did. He would reach for my hand, or lean his head on my shoulder, small, silent gestures of reassurance that spoke louder than any words. Our first real date was absurdly simple. We walked to the park near my apartment with a thermos of coffee and sat on a bench, watching the world go by. It was something we had done 100 times before as friends. But this time, he was holding my hand. This time, when I leaned my head on his shoulder, he turned and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my temple. Everything was the same, and yet everything was different. The world looked sharper, the colors more vibrant. I felt like I was seeing it all for the first time, through new eyes. I watched him as he started to tell people. It was a slow, careful process. He told his sister first, then a few of his closest friends. Each time, he would come back to me, a little lighter, a little more settled in this new skin. He was rewriting the story of himself, and I was privileged to be a witness, to be the person he came home to after each brave, terrifying step. I never felt impatient. I was a photographer, after all. I knew the value of waiting for the right light. One evening, months later, we were lying on the couch, tangled up together, watching some old movie. The credits were rolling, and the room was filled with the soft blue light of the screen. He was quiet for a long time, tracing patterns on my arm with his finger. "You know," he said softly, his voice a low rumble against my ear. For the longest time, I thought home was a place. A building, an address. My condo, this apartment. But I was wrong. He shifted so he could look at me, his eyes serious and clear in the dim light. "It's not a place," he continued. "It's a person. It's you, Leo. You're my home." The words were so simple, so direct, and they landed in the very center of my heart, healing cracks I didn't even know were still there. All the years of silent waiting, of quiet ache, of fearful hope, it had all led to this. To this man, in this room, telling me a truth so profound it rearranged my soul. I couldn't speak. I just leaned in and kissed him, a kiss full of gratitude and relief and a love so deep it felt like it had been there forever, just waiting to be named. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. And sometimes, if you are very, very lucky, you are brave enough to see past the disguise. You are brave enough to answer the quiet question, to cross the terrifying threshold, to risk the comfortable room of what is for the vast, unknown country of what could be. Our journey was not a straight line. It was a winding, uncertain path, full of fear and missteps and long, silent nights. But we navigated it. Together, we found our way out of the ambiguity and into the beautiful, honest clarity of the morning after. And we began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned, finally, to create together.